we have Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl paired with Olato Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olato Equiano, aka Gustavus Vasa, written by himself. So we had Equiano in the 18th century writing about his experience, which was not the typical experience for a slave. Why? He traveled a lot, and he was on a British naval ship, and he was in the 7 Years' War. Not a typical experience for a slave at all. And then we have Harriet Jacobs, who has more of a common experience for women in the early 1800s. And they were both of these narratives were written to bolster and encourage the abolition movement in England and in America. So hers wasn't published till 1861, and what happened 4 years later? The 13th Amendment, the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. So her book was published, and whether it helped the abolition movement or not, we don't really know, but it kind of died in obscurity for decades afterwards because slavery had been abolished and people were focusing on Reconstruction at that point. So I wanted to start by looking at these two front pieces of what we're looking at now, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olato Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, written by himself. Just look at these two for a minute and see what kind of similarities kind of jump out to you, and also differences. Can you see it? Any little thing that you notice? What's one of the first things that you notice?
Similar format.
Okay, similar format. So what do you notice about the titles?
Equiano's title kind of looks more like an adventure book or adventure novel.
Okay, good. An adventure novel, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olato Equiano, versus her title. Why do you think she gave it that title?
She doesn't mention her name.
She doesn't mention her name, very important. We'll get to that in a minute. But what are incidents?
Common. They're
Situations, things that happen. So is this claiming to be her whole life? Right? Is this claiming to be his whole life? Right, so this is the interesting narrative of the life of Olato Equiano, starting with where I was born, kidnapped, up until the time he wrote it. Whereas hers isn't claiming to be her whole entire life. She's left things out. Daniela or Omar mentioned that there's no name. Why not?
She didn't want it to reflect back on her.
She didn't want it to reflect back on her. Why else would a woman writing in the 1840s not include her name?
Maybe not to get caught on people for like writing it or something.
Say that again.
Like maybe she wouldn't want to like people to go back to her and find out that it was her writing it.
Okay. Why else? We have his name.
She's writing for more women than herself.
She's writing for more women than herself. Also, it wasn't uncommon for women writers not to put their name on books. Jane Austen, who's one of the most popular and still well-read and well-loved author, didn't put her name on her first few books. And other female authors used pseudonyms that sounded like a man. George Eliot. So women didn't always include their names because it wasn't proper for women to write. It wasn't accepted. People might look down on their family, but she had a lot of other reasons having to do with the sexual exploitation that she faced and the decisions that she made that she didn't want her name to be on there. So this little phrase, written by himself, written by herself. Why is that there?
To indicate that this is their point of view.
Okay, good. This is their point of view, and they actually wrote it. Now, so she didn't include her name largely because she's a woman, and for several reasons she didn't include her name. But both of them, and so this was not the first edition, this is the 9th edition, right? The first edition was written in 1789. So by 1794, we have 9 editions already, and he died in 1797. Price was 5 shillings. There's no price on this one. This is published in 1861. So they're making it clear, I wrote this. This is my writing. She has an editor, he doesn't. Okay, we'll learn a little bit more about the editor, but the editor, we have uncovered letters from Harriet Jacobs to the editor, and from the editor to Harriet Jacobs, and it's clear that she just cleaned it up a little. She didn't do serious editing. It didn't need serious editing, right? So it's more of a minor edit than a serious edit or a rewrite. This is in London. This is in Boston. Look at the pronouns here. What's the difference?
Sold by the author, he's receiving the profit.
Published for the author. All these seemingly small differences, but so the money that came out of her book, which wasn't much, would have gone to the publisher and some of it for her. He kept all the money, right? He got money for the book and he kept all the money. And he made a lot more money than she did many years later. Anything else you notice? What's in the middle of both of them? This is a passage from Isaiah, and this is a passage from Isaiah. Why do they both have a passage from Isaiah? What does that say about them as writers? They're influenced by religion, specifically Christianity. They can read the Bible. And they're also appealing to their audience, which is going to be a largely Christian audience at the time, right? So I think it's helpful to look at these to see the differences and also all the similarities. So a little background about slavery in America before we get right into her book. So in 1618, 20 slaves came to the Jamestown colony. We just had the 1619 project through the New York Times, which talks about the first slaves that came to America. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the southern U.S. There were never very many slaves in the north. There were some, it's a negligible number. So the increase from 16, 17, 18, 240 years, from 20 to 4 million. Most of that was from people born in Africa and brought over, but near, in 1808, 1809, slaves could not be imported anymore. So that increase is due to the birth rate. in the slave population. As we said, 20% died in the Middle Passage. The most common experience for a slave in the U.S. was to be on a plantation, either in the house or in the field. And most slave owners owned less than 20 slaves. So the typical experience is on some kind of plantation, and there are 5 to 15 slaves total. Rebellions were rare, but there were rebellions where slaves said, we are more in number than our masters, and if we gather together and get some firepower, maybe we can do something about it. And the Nat Turner's rebellion is mentioned in the parts of the book that we read. So the abolition movement, again, that's the abolition of slavery, abolition of the slave trade that happened in England in 1807, here in 1809. Abolition of slavery didn't happen in England till 1833, here in 1865. So there's a difference between the slave trade and the practice of slavery. These were some of the key figures of the abolition movement in the 1800s. And the abolition movement was closely aligned to a women's movement for equality, and Lucretia Mott and Sarah and Angela Grimke were very involved in that. There's a great historical novel that I really love called The Invention of Wings, and it features Sarah and Angela Grimke. It's based on a lot of research, but it is a novel. So if you're interested in these characters in that time period, I highly recommend it. The Fugitive Slave Act is mentioned in the book, and the Fugitive Slave Act turned Northerners into spies and into slave capturers, right? It was part of the Compromise of 1850, so largely the southern United States is slaveholding. It's part of the economy. It's deeply entrenched. And the Northerners do not depend on slaves for their economy. And for both moral, ethical, and a lot of other reasons, a lot of people are against slavery, but the slave owners are saying, this is our livelihood. If you take away our slaves, you're going to have to pay us. Do you have the money to pay us? So one of the compromises was the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, we won't do away with slavery, but you have to return our slaves if they flee. Through the Underground Railroad or however, if they flee, they have to be returned. They're not allowed a trial. And if you harbor somebody, you're going to be punished. So it was a serious act and had a lot of implications. We talked about pseudonyms. So why did she use a pseudonym? Female authors sometimes use pseudonyms. And also because she didn't want people to know who she was, as we said, because of the sexual exploitation and what happened to her and choices that she made. So that's why she used a synonym. What's the difference between an autobiography and a biography?
Autobiography is written by yourself. Biography is usually written by someone else.
Yeah, so autobiography is supposed to be you're writing about your own life and you're relating events that really happened. Sometimes there is inflation and embellishment in autobiographies, but generally they should be an accurate representation. But you do have to keep in mind that the person who lived through this is telling the story, and it's from their perspective, and their feelings about what happened are going to color how they write it. And a biography is somebody, either authorized or unauthorized, somebody else is writing about a person either living or dead. So we have biographies written about Harriet Jacobs, and we have biographies written about Equiano, but we have their own words. So what's a primary source? Is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl a primary source?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Written in the first person. the letters and other things, are they primary sources or secondary sources? Letters that she wrote to her editor wrote to her, they're primary sources. They're written at the time period by the people involved, right? So when you're in a history class, and if you have a really great professor, he or she will help you and will find for you primary sources. Primary sources are gold when you're talking about literature or history. Secondary sources would be others who are writing about things that happened and people. But the people themselves write it, they're primary sources. So both the interesting narrative and incidents are primary sources. Some of the themes: resistance, self-preservation, the extent to which somebody will preserve their life or preserve their own life, maybe even at the expense of others. Survival, where do we see survival in Equiano's account?
Shown in that we saw it again when Captain Vasco tries to sell him to Captain James.
Okay. Tries to survive by not being sold again. Where else do we see survival in Equiano's account? On the ship, okay, how he survived, and by not drowning several times. So he survived a lot. How does Jacob survive? What are some of the things that she does to survive?
She hides in an attic for 7 years.
She hides in an attic. She had, just before that incident, gone to Flint's son's plantation and thought that maybe as long as she was away from him, she'd be okay. What did Dr. Flint want her to do? He built a cabin for her. Talk about, somebody wealthy and he wants to keep a mistress and he puts her up in it. He built a whole cabin for Harriet Jacobs and told her, go live there and I'll just visit you. She said, no possible way. I'm not doing that. I'd rather go stay on your son's plantation. Fine, go stay on my son's plantation. But when she saw that her kids might suffer, and her kids, some of them were still at home, she came back, and she couldn't flee, so the best alternative for her, that's self-preservation and survival. Her grandma said, you could stay up here in this little spot. I'm sure not knowing it would be 7 years that she was there. Color and identity. So one of the things you'll notice about Harriet Jacobs is that she is very light-skinned. She could have passed for white. So that's Harriet Jacobs, and that's Dr. Flint. His real name is Norcom. So that's her slave master, and that's Harriet Jacobs. So kind of the rule was that if you had a drop of black blood, you were considered black. Mark Twain wrote a brilliant play called Pudd'nhead Wilson. Has anybody read it? So at the beginning of the play, there's a slave and there's the master's wife, and they're both pregnant, and they both give birth to a son on pretty much the same night. And the slave puts her son in the master's wife's crib and takes the master's son and raises him as her own. She is 1/16 black, the slave, and so her son is 1/32 black, and probably as fair as I am. They didn't notice. They had just had the babies, and so the slave grows up as the master's son, and the master's son grows up as a slave. It's also an argument for nature versus nurture. So what do you think happens? The master's son talks like a slave, thinks like a slave, acts like a slave. The slave talks like a master, acts like a master, thinks like a master. And Mark Twain is pointing out the ridiculousness of race. What is race? It's a construct. At what point do you decide somebody is black or white or not? Where's the line? You're 1/32 black. So she is extremely fair, right, and could have passed as white. So color and identity. So what am I? And you weren't called black in that time. You were called colored or a slave, right? So color and identity is a huge thing. Social justice. How did Equiano get his freedom? He bought himself. Harriet Jacobs refused to buy herself. She could have. Her grandmother could have bought her. She refused. So also different ways of seeing your identity. And so Equiano said self-preservation, survival. I'm going to make some money. I'm going to free myself. If I have to buy myself, that's what I'm going to do. Harriet Jacobs said, I will flee, I will run, I will hide. I'm not going to give you a penny for myself. I am my own person and I'm not going to do that. So different ways of approaching their life as a slave. Civil disobedience, so we have Henry David Thoreau and Martin Luther King Jr. And if you've read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, one of my absolute favorite pieces, he talks about just laws and unjust laws. Does anybody know what King says about just laws and unjust laws?
I wrote a paper on this, so I'm trying to remember it.
Give it a try. So an unjust law is a law that is not applied equally to different groups of people. So a law can seem just on the surface. Take a parade permit, okay? You need a permit to have a parade. But there are all these other requirements. You have to fill this form out and sign your name. So if somebody's illiterate, they're not going to be able to get that parade permit, right? Even our voting laws in this country, I would say, are not all just. That's why we have the Civil Rights Act. You shouldn't have to be able to do certain things in order to be able to vote. One of the pushes now, one of the prison reforms is to allow people who have been convicted of a felony to vote. And I think they recently did something in Florida that's going to open up the door to a lot more people voting than had been. So what makes a law just or unjust is if it's applied differently to different groups, it's not a just law. And if it's not a just law, not only can you break it, you should break it. That's civil disobedience, right? So if you're telling me I have to sit in the back of the bus, or I have to use a different water fountain, or I can't go into this area of town, that's not a just law. And looking at education, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. So we can have schools that have all black students and that's just as good as the schools with all white students. No, it's not. So in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education said no, separate is not equal, and we need to do something about it. We had busing for a while, and I think at this point we've given up. I don't know. But so all of these are themes and issues. And the other one of sexual power, not only just of men having sexual power, but in particular white men, in particular white slaveholders. And so that's definitely a theme. So these are some of the themes. There are other themes. So a little bit of the history of the manuscript. It's written between 1853 and 1858. Published in 1861, 4 years before the end of the Civil War. Jacobs lived until 1897, and the letters that were discovered by Jean Yellen, who was a professor, discovered these letters. Her book was published again in 1970, and letters were discovered that prove, between her and the editor, that she did indeed write the book, and that the editor didn't do much to change it. So these are the names of the people in the book, and these are their real names. So Harriet Jacobs is called Linda Brent. Mother and father is Delilah Horniblow and Elijah Knox. Her brother's actual name is John. Her kids are Louisa and Joseph. And Dr. Flint is James Norcom. his wife. Mr. Sands, who she has, who's a white lawyer in town, who she has a consensual sexual relationship with, is Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. So also, she wanted to keep her identity secret so people like her family and also the father of her children wouldn't be exposed. So there was a lot of reasons for her to use a pseudonym. So just briefly, what is the story about? So she's born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina. This house where she lived is now a museum. And she was the property of Margaret Horniblow. She says in the beginning that I was a slave from the time I was born, but I didn't know it until I was 6 years old. So she had a fairly good childhood. When Horniblow died, she bequeathed as property the 11-year-old Harriet to her 3-year-old niece. So a 3-year-old is owning an 11-year-old. And Harriet then becomes a slave to Dr. James Norcom. And he continually harasses her. When he realizes she can read, he not only harasses her verbally, he writes her notes. She does not say in the book that he ever raped her. So if we're going to believe her book, then he never did rape her. So what could be the reasons for that? He wanted her to agree to a sexual relationship. I don't know all the possible reasons for that. But it was obvious that he wanted to have sex with her, and she put him off as long as possible until she fled. She was avoiding his advances for years, and at that point, she formed a relationship with the lawyer, a white lawyer in town, and had 2 kids with him. Thinking that would help, it didn't stop Dr. Flint from continuing to want a relationship with her. He threatened to send her to his plantation, and as you know, she did flee. She came back. Their father bought their children's freedom, and as we know, she hid in this crawl space 3 feet high, 7 feet by 9 feet for 7 years. She read, wrote, and sewed to pass the time. She did eventually flee to Philadelphia, then she worked in several places in the north, and was eventually given her freedom decades later. Okay, so that's just a brief overview. We're going to get into it much more in depth next week. Can you turn that off for me? And you guys look like you're getting ready. I've gone over.